Our speaker tonight is Glenn Kreisberg. Glenn Kreisberg is an author, radio engineer, and New York State DEC outdoor guide who researches archaeoastronomy as well as landscape archaeology. And he studies that in the Hudson Valley and Catskill Mountains areas here in New York. He served 2 terms as vice president of the New England Antiquities Research Association. He's a co-founder of nonprofit Overlook Mountain Center in Woodstock, New York. He has studied archaeoastronomy at State University, New York, and he's also studied archaeoacoustics on Malta through the Old Temple Study Foundation and Heritage Malta. Glenn can be seen on the History Channel. He was interviewed for The Unexplained with William Shatner and Ancient Aliens. Glenn's talk tonight is titled Indigenous Stone Structures of Upstate New York. And with that, let's welcome Glenn.
So good evening, everyone. And I want to thank Bart, and who I've never met, and Michael Goldstein also for inviting me to come speak to you folks tonight. Happy to be here. We're going to get the presentation up. Okay, so I do like to start with an interesting fact. In the 1880 US Census, part of that was a survey that was done during the 1870s leading up to that census, what was called a stone fence survey of New England, the Northeast in general. And they documented about 240,000 miles of stone construction, stone wall in the Northeast. So if you think about that, that's a lot of stonework, 240,000 miles. That would reach to the moon, would wrap around the earth 10 times. And to think that the people who were here from say 1680 to 1880 built all of that stone, it's a little counterlogical or counterintuitive. There must have been some of that stonework existing in the Northeast region before the Europeans arrived. So we're going to look a little bit at that. I'm hitting the arrow and it's not going. Let's see.
Just put the mouse on the presentation.
Yep, let me click on that. And exactly. Okay, so we're talking about cultural and ceremonial landscapes. And, I'm sure everybody in this room that's walked around in the woods has seen some interesting, unusual things in the woods. We see old cellar holes, we see old quarries, we see stone walls, stone mounds, all kinds of interesting things that are most likely cultural. So, everything that is a cultural landscape is not a ceremonial landscape, but everything that's a ceremonial landscape is a cultural landscape. So here we see a quarry in the bottom left, and we see a millstone harvest site from here in the Shwangunks. And those are absolutely cultural, but not necessarily ceremonial. So there's a lot of different types of features that we're going to look at throughout this presentation. I'm going to move kind of quickly because we do have a lot to cover. I always like to reference my old friend Doug Harris, who was the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Narragansett tribe of Rhode Island for 20 years, now retired. And he was taught by his ancestors to let the landscape speak. The landscape has something to say, and if we know how to look at it and analyze it, there are some things there that we can learn. So when we talk about archaeoastronomy and landscape archaeology, what exactly are we talking about? We have to start at the beginning and acknowledge. Now, my daughter says, "Dad, you're not Native American. How can you talk about Native American things?" And she's right, I'm not Native American. I'm also not an archaeologist. But I think if you speak about another culture respectfully and responsibly, of course, you can talk about other cultures that you don't belong to. And, we have plenty of professors who are teaching Greek who are not Greek. So to acknowledge the land that the school is on, where we shop, where we live, where we send our kids to play, is all on lands that were and still are ancestral lands of Native Americans, who in many cases lost it or ceded rights to that land against their will through manipulation or potentially violence. And it's important that we recognize their culture, that we build partnerships to help Indigenous and non-Indigenous groups get along and heal. So I always like to acknowledge that at the beginning. So we're going to be looking at what the Algonquin would call Manitou Asenel, and that would be local Munsee for spirit stones. And these are stones that are found in the woods. In some cases, they may resemble effigies, like this one could potentially be interpreted as a turtle. A lot of the work that I do builds on the work that was done by previous researchers. James Maver and Byron Dix wrote this book that came out in the late 80s called Manitou, The Sacred Landscape of New England's Native Civilization. And just the title itself, Native Civilization, connotates that there was a civilization here before Europeans arrived, which isn't always acknowledged. So Maver and Dix were not lightweights. Maver there on the left worked as a naval architect at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute in Massachusetts. He was one of the co-inventors of the Alvin submersible submarine in the early 1970s. And Byron Dix was an optics engineer, pictured on the right, worked for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory at NASA. And they were both NERA members, New England Antiquities Research Association, that really studied this stuff. And in their book Manitou, they really made the case that Native Americans built in stone and in many cases aligned their constructions with events on the horizon. So this is archaeoastronomy, or what we would call observational astronomy. So I bought a book years ago, a wonderful book by Ignatius Donnelly called Atlantis, the Antediluvian Civilization. And when I opened that used book, and the front cover was gold, there were old newspaper clippings, which is always a big bonus. And what you have going on here is a excavation in Santorini in the Mediterranean in the late 1960s, 1967. And on the bottom left, actually, I don't know if you could see it. I don't know if this is going to work. Oh, look at that. So that's James Maver right there from Woods Hole, overseeing the excavations at Santorini, which were linked to Atlantis. And this made the New York Times in the Science edition during the week, and it even made the Science edition on the Sunday New York Times for that weekend of July 22nd, 1967. So, these were serious researchers who really put it out there that Native Americans in the Northeast did in fact carry out observational astronomy. This is an infographic developed by Overlook Mountain Center that shows some of the sites that are considered archaeoastronomically aligned, some of the types of charts that we use to document these things. And basically, archaeoastronomy is the study of how ancient people studied the sky, used what they observed to inform their worldview and belief system. And if a landscape represents a living synthesis between the land and the people who inhabit it, a skyscape is a landscape that includes a portion of the sky or horizon from which cultural stories can be constructed. The elements of the sky world, including the sun, the moon, the stars, the Milky Way, served purpose and held meaning, connecting the celestial world above to the plane of the living through stories, actions, communities, spirituality. And the sky was both the ancestor and the teacher, leading the way to eternity. And of course, we know around the world, many different cultures practice archaeoastronomy and studying the sky and the stars. And it was one of the very preeminent preoccupations, you could say, of pre-literate cultures, studying the sky. These are a couple of examples of archaeoastronomy sites around the world. Of course, Stonehenge in the upper left. On the right, upper right is Mandajar, which is it's on Malta. It's the oldest still functioning solar calendar on Earth, about 7,000 years old. The bottom is Coachella down in Peru, which is also a solar observatory. And on the right, we actually have a chamber from Putnam County that has its entrance aligned with the winter solstice sunrise. And there are hundreds of those chambers located across the river. This is from inside that chamber on a solstice morning, shortest day of the year. And you see you get a light phenomenon where the kind of a light dagger comes in through the entrance and projects onto the back wall. And I should shout out a researcher named Enrique Negura, who's passed away many years now. But Enrique was known for leading tours to these chambers on December 21st, and being in there with his Super 8 film camera filming these sunrises. So it's a very well documented phenomenon in many of the chambers. Not all of them are winter solstice sunrise. Some of them are equinox alignments due east. In Larry David's book, The Orion Zone, he documented how the Anasazi, the ancestral Hopi Indians in the Southwest, moved their encampments, their habitation zones, to line up with the solstice sunrises, mostly the winter solstice sunrise and summer solstice sunset. And you can see some of those archaeological sites that are documented along those bearings. It's also interesting to note, David Overson in his book, Secret Architecture of the Nation's Capital, showed how the original Enfant layout of DC also had many astronomical alignments with the avenues, many of them aligned with solstices and equinox, but also some of them with the rising of Venus. And these intentional alignments are found locally in the communities in which we live. Here we've got both the Hurley and the Woodstock Dutch Reformed Church and the main streets in those towns that lead to those churches aligned with a particular angle, 122 degrees southeast, which is the true bearing to the winter solstice sunrise at our latitude. Also, the KTD Monastery, the center of Tibetan Buddhism in the US, up on the summit of Overlook Mountain, also has its orientation, as you can see, to the winter solstice sunrise at 122. So this was a phenomenon kind of worldwide where ancient people, and even in modern times, aligned many of their constructions, temples, and buildings to these alignments. I'd like to mention Jean Michel's and his work in The New View Over Atlantis, where he showed how many of the sites throughout Great Britain were also aligned astronomically, many times pagan sites that were in locations where Christian churches were later built. So the problem in our area is that in the textbooks used here in this university, there's the quote from Herbert Kraft, who says there's absolutely no proof that man-made megaliths or dolmens, with or without grave objects, or any other manifestation of old world funerary construction or astronomical alignments exist in Lenape territory in the Northeast, and the burden of proof is on those who make such claims, like myself. And in that book, it says, thus far, none of these claims have been supported, and there's not a lot of satisfactory scientific evidence to make that case. But I would argue there is, and part of what I'm going to show tonight is exactly that. Now, as I mentioned, it's not generally accepted by academics, but it is accepted by the Native American population. And this resolution passed by USET, the United Southern and Eastern Tribes, in 2007, quotes, within the ancestral territories of USET tribes, there exist sacred ceremonial stone landscapes and their stone structures, which are of particular cultural value to certain member tribes. For thousands of years before immigration of Europeans, the medicine people of the USET tribal ancestors used these sacred landscapes to sustain the people's reliance on Mother Earth and the spirit energies of balance and harmony. Whether these stone structures are massive or small structures, stacked stone rows or effigies, these prayers and stones are often mistaken for by archaeologists and state historic preservation officers as the efforts of farm clearing for stones for agricultural wall building purposes. So we're here to kind of challenge the status quo and go along with what the Native Americans have identified themselves as ceremonial stone landscapes that exist in our territory. Now, there's been progress, and there was a conference over 10 years ago now up at Colgate University. Anthony Avini, who some of you as astronomers probably are aware, one of America's premier archaeoastronomers, he was invited to give a symposium at Colgate University after Lori Rush, who's the cultural resource manager for Fort Drum up in the Adirondacks, contacted him and said she had found interesting stone features on the fort, on the fort property that she believed were astronomically aligned. He came and checked it out. And what was really important and gave a lot of confirmation at this conference that you had different groups of people. You had not only the academics, but you did have for the first time Native American, tribal historic preservation officials. You also had members of the federal Department of Interior, Department of the Forest Service, Park Service. A lot of officials were at this conference, and for the first time, they basically had to admit that a lot of these cultural features were not on their radar. They really, for the first time, acknowledged that they need to pay more attention to archaeoastronomy in upstate New York, as well as the Northeast in general. So that was an important moment when those folks got together. And we also had members of tribes from the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, from the Narragansett, from certain tribes that have migrated up to Ontario, who shared their stories of the sky. And this symposium took place at the Tung Ho Visualization Center at Colgate, which is a mini high-tech planetarium where you sit back and you can put up on the sky dome anything that's happened over the past 10 or 20,000 years. So those stories were shared and there was an important acknowledgement. Turning to my research, what I've done is I built a database in sites in our region and the different features that they contain. And with a database, you can filter and you can sort and you can look for patterns of concentration and distribution on the land that help you better understand what these sites are. And if you plot them out using GIS and see where their locations are, you can start to see that there are patterns. On the bottom right, what you have is the cluster of chambers, megalithic chambers in Putnam County. On the left of the Hudson, on the west side, you see Catskill sites. And when I plotted these Catskill sites and I started looking for a particular pattern on how they might connect, one thing jumped out at me was that they all seemed to align with each other along a certain set of bearings. Now, the chart on the left was provided by Professor Curtis Hoffman of UMass Bridgewater, and that gives us the angles or azimuths to the horizon at our latitude, about 42 degrees north of the equator, what you would expect to see on the horizon on the shortest and longest days of the year. So this clues you in for where you should be looking and in what direction. And what's nice about archaeoastronomy is the numbers are the numbers. They don't really lie. They are what they are. Either it lines up or it doesn't. And then it's up to us whether we want to ascribe some meaning or interpretation to that. But if we look a little more closely at the notes at the bottom, we have to account for deviation, of course, because magnetic north and true north are different about 14 and a quarter degrees. So if you're looking at 122 in the field, it's going to be on the compass about 136. But on the map with a protractor, you'll be plotting it out at about 122 degrees. And then if we add the 18.6-year lunar minimum and maximum cycle, we see that they're kind of add and subtract 7 degrees to those minimums and maximums of the solstice. And of course, it takes nearly 19 years for it to make that full swing that the sun makes in a single year. If we put that into 3 dimensions, it allows us to kind of understand where observatories might be relative to the horizon and to monuments. So if we're claiming that there are alignments that point to something on the horizon, it has to be looked at from a particular place, and that would be a potential observatory, as shown in the middle there. And what I would mention is that Native Americans had a lot of alignments, not just solstice alignments, but because their spiritual activities were basically a shamanistic practice where one of the members of the tribe would facilitate communication to the underworld or the sky world. They had a very 3-dimensional worldview. So the shaman would, through portals that were aligned to these specific azimuths, conduct ceremony and, for the benefit of the tribe, communicate with the spirit world. And you can see some of these alignments to entrances to the underworld. An entrance is not an exit, an exit is not an entrance, and vice versa. So they're very particular alignments, and if the constructions line up, if you find things in the woods that match these, potentially they are indigenous in origin. So we're going to start first by looking at what's known as the Hammonasset Line. This is a long distance, many hundreds of miles, that goes from a large Council Rock out on Montauk, passes through Connecticut, and kind of intersects with our region in the Catskills. This is Council Rock out at Fort Pond, out near the end of Long Island. This is called Council Rock because the Montauk Indians would hold council here for many, many centuries, and that was recorded when Europeans arrived. Now, what's interesting is that on the exact bearing of the winter solstice sunrise, summer solstice sunset, that line from Long Island intersects using computer software with the Devil's Tombstone Monument up here between Phoenicia and Hunter Mountain. So it's kind of interesting that in fact is a true alignment. And I have to credit Tom Paul, who's no longer with us, a longtime NERA member who documented from his property in Madison, Connecticut, from hilltop to hilltop, all the way down to the Sound and through Connecticut, different sites that sat on that line that shared that same solstice bearing. So this is part of his research. And you can see the site. What you have there are flags of burial grounds, including the one on Montauk by Fort Pond, which is actually still a modern cemetery. And you can see where that line goes, passing through Connecticut and New York up to our region. Where it intersects the Catskills is actually at what's known as the Wall of the Manitou, or the Spirit Wall, which is a geographic feature that runs basically from Woodstock up to Catskill, about 14 or 15 miles, and forms the eastern escarpment of the Catskill Mountains with the Hudson Valley. So it's kind of coincidental, to say the least, that it comes up through our region and intersects with something that's known as the Wall of the Manitou. Here are some of the sites that have been plotted along it. Devil's Tombstone, wonderful monument up there near Phoenicia. Now, this map shows where that line from Long Island passes right through Stony Clove and intersects with some of the stone features that have been identified there, including 2 calendar stones up on Plateau Mountain, which we'll look a little bit closer at. As you hike up the Plateau Mountain Trail from Stony Clove, you pass this kind of unassuming stone. It was reported in the NERA Journal in 1980 by a gentleman named Jay Wilcox, and he shows how it has numerous alignments, including the 303, which is 318 magnetic, and that's the summer solstice sunset in the northwest. Now, this is the view from the top of Plateau Mountain, looking in that direction to the northwest. Now, if you cross over the summit, you come to this really interesting stone we call the Plateau Mountain Calendar Stone. It's got an inscription of a sun glyph right on its face. Quite old, quite lichenated. And it's oriented to 136 magnetic, which is 122 true, pointing right down the line towards where that terminus is, or out on Long Island at Montauk. Now, I went up there many years, and you can see below the glyph, there's an inscription, some letters, and it wasn't until I went up there in the winter and brushed it off that the sun highlighted those letters well enough for me to transcribe them. And they're Latvian, and they say the Latvian sun god Sol Ne, Northeast. So who put that there and when is an open question. I don't think it's indigenous by any means, but it was obviously from it's obviously a cultural monument, and most likely done by a community of Latvians who may have lived in that Hunter Mountain area during early American times. So now this is showing where the line comes up into the Catskills. You can see the Wall of the Manitou right there, going up from Woodstock. And the Lewis Hollow site is one that we're going to look at a little bit more in depth further in this presentation. But this is the ceremonial landscape of Woodstock, because there are numerous sites that have been documented. And one of the patterns here is that they're found in all the hollows, and all the hollows are places where streams originate. And those streams, flow down to creeks, that flow to the rivers, that flow to the ocean. So in many cases where these ceremonial landscapes are built are marking headwaters to important waterways. And it makes sense in many instances. So we're going to jump down to the ground now and see what some of these look like. This is the site in Mink Hollow in Lake Hill, New York. It's right on the county line, and it's the headwater of the Beaverkill, the Little Beaverkill, which flows to the Esopus, flows to the Hudson, which flows to the Atlantic Ocean. So if you're up in Mink Hollow, this is the type of thing you're going to see built on the ground. And you can see in some cases they line up in rows. They're about 1 meter high, in some cases 2 meters across. Some of them are still in very good shape, like this one. This is something that's interpreted as a serpent wall because what you have there is a large boulder that's got a pile of stones on the top of it with a trail of stones leading away from it. Not really anything practical. This is not an enclosure. This is not agriculture or farm related. To me, this is more of a symbol of a serpent or a snake. Now you can see, oh, should I admit him? Okay, there we go. You can see there are walls that are associated with cairns. You almost always find the piles of stones next to the walls. And it begs the question, you know, to me, it makes the argument that they were contemporaneous. They were built in conjunction with each other, because if you were going to go build a bunch of stone piles in the woods and there was a stone wall there, why wouldn't you scavenge from that wall to build those piles, and vice versa? You wanted to build a nice wall and you had a bunch of piles, why wouldn't you scavenge from those piles? So to me, there's an argument to be made that when you see stones in piles and in walls in conjunction, there's a good argument that they were contemporaneous and made at the same period of time. And this wall, it hasn't been checked, but you can see it points to the horizon, and the horizon is raised here. And because I'm with a bunch of astronomers, you know that if you're going to be taking an azimuth to a horizon, and that chart that Curtis Hoffman provided is for a 0-degree horizon. If you've got a 5 or an 8-degree horizon, then you've got to adjust those azimuths accordingly, and you know, subtract from them or add to them. In fact, you would add to them, you wouldn't subtract, because that would be going below grade. But in this case, you've got, and I've been told, I think 1 finger at arm's length is about 1 degree. So that's 3 degrees above the horizon. This is probably about 5 degrees. So you wouldn't expect the sun to come over at whatever, and this is oriented towards the winter solstice sunrise. You would expect it instead of 122, perhaps 130 or 128 degrees. Now, I'd like to point out this type of stone construction on this wall because it's really not typically European. This is a little more haphazard. When you see European stonework, the masonry is much more conforming to European standards of aesthetics, where you have horizontal, lateral courses laid one after another. You don't see anything like that here. But this is a very interesting and atypical wall compared to most colonial or early American walls. This is also a very sturdy wall. You'd be hard pressed to find a single stone in there that is loose. Another very interesting feature of this wall, if you notice in this picture, it's really not a two-sided wall. This is a wall where it's more like a terrace. On one side, the land actually comes up to the top of the wall, and then it drops off on the other side. So it's, again, not what we typically think of as a wall, but more like a land terrace. This particular wall, you can see, is oriented on the compass to due north-south. About where you can see the tree here, it makes a dog leg and makes a right-hand turn at a very particular angle, and runs a little distance at that. And also in Minkalo, there's cairns that have little chambers or cysts inside. One of them, when I investigated it, it turned out it had a little pedestal with an oyster cell sitting on the top of that pedestal. So to me, that was very confirming that this was marking a headwater, because, as I said, this what flows right out of Minkalo, and it is on a watershed where on the east it flows to the Hudson, but if you go over to Greene County, now the watershed is the Schoharie and the Mohawk River. So this is marking the headwaters of the Hudson. The Hudson used to be replete with oysters. When Europeans arrived, oyster harvesting from the Hudson was quite common until they depleted them. So here we have an oyster cell sitting on a pedestal within a cairn, marking the headwater. And you can see on this map, Lewis Hollow, Mink Hollow, Silver Hollow, they're all headwaters to creeks that flow into streams that feed rivers that flow down to the ocean. Silver Hollow, near member David Holden, he mapped it out quite nicely. This is a really fascinating site because you've got walls, mega walls, cairns, what you have on the right here are piles of stone. You've also got these unusual, I don't know what you call them, protrusions, and you've got curved corners instead of right angles. So if you look at what that looks like in the woods, you're going to see, and when I say mega wall, you know, that's a 6-foot staff. So that wall is almost 10 feet tall. And you've got a boulder near the top there that's probably 500 pounds with one under it that's at least 300. So these were not small undertakings to make these walls. And you can see here's a curved section. The way these walls, what we call mega walls, they're actually double walls. So it's 2 walls that are constructed, and then between them, they fill it with rubble. And you can also see these mounds, very different from the Mink Hollow mounds. They're about 20 feet across, about 10 feet high. And this is just using an app that shows that some of these walls are oriented east-west as well as north-south. And you can see that from the map. Now, using LiDAR, if you look closely, you can see the features north and south. You can see there's an interesting, like almost a circle of cairns right here. And that got me thinking, using the LiDAR, what else could I spot in the woods nearby? And if you look off to the east a little bit from here, you can see there's a couple of things here that appear to be similar constructions or stone mounds. And if I highlight them, you can see they're almost perfectly in a straight line, going from Mink Hollow, which is off to the east, over to Silver Hollow, which is in the west. And in Silver Hollow, we also found a cairn with a cyst in it. Nothing was inside this one, but it did have an orientation towards the sunrise on the shortest day of the year. Many of these constructions are on bedrock, which really help them, again, stand the test of time. Without that type of foundation built straight on the ground, these things don't last very long because of environmental conditions like the freeze and thaw cycle, frost heaves. If this was built straight on the ground, it would get, you know, kind of decrepit over a few decades. Whereas if you build it on a foundation of bedrock, really, you know, nothing short of humans disturbing it or something, you know, a seismic event, these things are going to be around a while. Now in Bearsville Hollow, what you have going on are what we call turtle cairns. And there's a whole series of them where you've got a stone that looks like it's tucked in that could potentially be interpreted as the headstone. Each one of these has a large stone that you can see is in the position of the head of a turtle. This one, the head is tucked in. And you know, here it looks like you've got a couple of them kind of marching right towards you. And turtles shouldn't really be surprising in Native American culture, because part of every Native American creation myth, almost ubiquitously across the US, a turtle is part of that myth, of that creation myth. Now, what's really fascinating is where this site is in Bearsville. It's all those cairns are built around this effigy stone, which is natural. But I do believe that ancient indigenous people would survey their landscape, the region they inhabited, and they would look for any type of features that might help support or express their worldview and their belief system. And having found this rock that obviously looks like a turtle in many respects, they built these stone monuments basically in its proximity. And as I mentioned, turtles are really part of creation myth. I think what the creation story goes, there's a worldwide flood, which is with many creation stories around the world. And an animal is sent by who? Never quite sure, by the creator, I guess, down to the bottom of the water body, pulls up a clump of earth. This could be a beaver, this could be a muskrat, it depends on the creation myth, and plops it on the back of a turtle, and then repeats that and keeps repeating that until you have what Native Americans call Turtle Island, which is North America. So we do see turtles quite a bit. Here's one in Westkill and one in Connecticut. We also see serpents. Serpent effigies are quite common. And again, a representation of the underworld spirit in many regards. This is a site up in Halcutt Mountain, coming out, the source of the Bushnell Kill. And kill, of course, is stream in Dutch. So this flows, the Bushnell Kill flows through Bushnellville, which is off Route 42 near Shandaken. It flows into the Esopus Creek and down to the Hudson River. Beautiful waterfall there. These are the kind of cairns. There's our dog Smudge, who passed. He would love coming on these adventures and checking out what we'd find in the woods. This site is really amazing. It's got cairns on a hillside, all marking where springs flow out of the earth and into the Bushnell Kill. You can see in this particular cairn, the stream is, it's marking the source of the spring right there. And you've got this hillside up here that's all green. And that carpet of green, you can see right there, forms in the springtime from those springs. Just to the left is brown, off to the right is brown, but where these cairns are built on the hillside, you have springs coming out and feeding into the Bushnell Kill. It's also a wonderful serpent wall there, a serpentine wall that snakes through the woods. You can see very old looking, archaic. This site on Halcott Mountain was actually featured in the 2017 Ulster County Tourist Guide, where they claimed it was a 3,000-year-old ceremonial site. I don't know who wrote that guide. I don't know where they got the information, but it's not out of the realm of the possible, because certainly 3,000 years ago, there were Native Americans in this region. Michael Kudish, who's wrote the book on the Catskill Forest Preserve, he looks at these site locations and determines if there was any industrial or agricultural use. And he found out that in this particular location, there was no recording of early American or colonial activity, industrial or agricultural. And really, nobody would try to farm this land. It's too rocky. But you can see this wall is a double wall, two sides filled in between with rubble. And it doesn't really lead anywhere, and it doesn't really enclose anything. So quite interesting, and also does not conform to that European aesthetic of masonry that we would expect to see. Another serpent wall that's up there in Halcott Mountain in wintertime. Again, doesn't lead anywhere, doesn't enclose anything. To me, it's a symbol of some kind of belief system. Now, not too far from Halcott Mountain and Bushnell Kill, you've got the West Kill site in Spruceton Valley. Now, that's a whole different watershed, only a few miles away. And this, of course, the West Kill flows to the west where the sun sets, why it's called the West Kill. We've got larger cairns, greater sized cairns up there. Also ones that look like turtle effigies. Ones that have, that one, once somebody tells you that looks like a turtle, it's hard not to see a turtle. But if nobody suggested it's a turtle, would we see that was one or not? I'm not sure. Some of these have really interesting little caverns or cysts in the middle. This one, either it collapsed or people dug into it to see what it contained. But there's also a theory that these were constructed intentionally with these ramps on them. This is the only one I've seen, but people have reported ones in New England that look very similar. Another one with a little cavity or cyst inside of it. And this site, as I mentioned, is oriented to the west where the sun sets. There are walls with large stones on the caps, also in conjunction with those cairns. And this also runs towards the summer solstice sunset. As the sun sets in the valley to the west, these cairns actually light up. And even though you're in the middle of the mountains down a deep valley, as the sun sets on the solstice, the sun does come all the way down to the horizon and shines up the valley, illuminating some of these constructions on the summer solstice sunset. All right, we're going to jump a little more locally here and look at some sites here in the Shwangunks. In Shwangunks, everybody knows about Mohonk Mountain House and the long history of climbing. I'm an old climber. That's me on the left back in the day. I'm not sure who that is on the right, but of course, world-class climbing, and people come from all over the planet to experience this kind of rock and these kinds of exposures. But there's some really interesting geology in this environment. And of course, the Shawangunk Mountains are the last few miles of the Appalachian Mountains. When you get to the Catskills or the Taconics or the White or Green Mountains in the Adirondacks, that's all a different geologic feature. The Appalachian Mountains that come up from the south, the Smoky, the Blue Ridge, right up into Pennsylvania, and the Kittanini, and then the Shawangunks all kind of came out of the same mold, geologically speaking. And it's fascinating. And we're going to look at a bunch of sites along the ridge line. You've got, of course, the Sky Lakes there, Lake Awasting, Lake Minnewaska, Lake Mohonk in the north. And behind, and these are some of the sites that we're going to kind of visit here. We're going to look at the Peterskill Dolmen, which is on the summit of the high, what's called the Dickey Bar Preserve, or the High Peterskill Preserve in Minnewaska. And this boulder is set up in a particular way, again, on a ridge line that has pretty much panoramic views in all directions. And it's a compass stone in that whoever set it up made sure to orient it to the cardinal directions. And you've got a north point, you've got a south point, and you've got a west point, all on this compass stone. So, where some of these stones are acting as a compass on the landscape, or maybe they were geodetic or geodesic markers at some point associated with some type of measurement. I like to kind of speculate and understand why people would do this, but to me, this is definitely intentional and set up. Right across the valley from that is, and actually there's a trail. If you hike, the trail goes right through here. It's not marked. Some people say it's the original trail from the Catskills down to the Shawangunks. But if you cross through that little saddle and you go up onto the true summit there, you get to this interesting quarry site where you can see that some industrialist people at some point cut the whole corner out of the bedrock there, dressed it. You can see those cut up pieces in the foreground. And it was obviously done before that pitch pine ever grew. And that's an old pitch pine there. If you know pitch pines, they take a long time to get that large in diameter. You can see this was, in my estimation, some industrious young men from the Rondout Valley at some point came up here and harvested this stone to sell, to help support their livelihood and their families. Quite an undertaking, done with primitive tools, no power. And then, of course, it had to be transported down the mountain. And there is no trail or carriage road to this location. So whatever path they use to transport their quarry work no longer exists. I was up there with a group from the Adirondack Mountain Club a couple of winters ago, and you can see the views are much better when the leaves are off the trees from that location. And as we were hiking out, we came across this interesting feature, which looks like a stone throne or a chair facing north. Somebody suggested it could be a birthing chair. I think that's a bit of a stretch, but there is definitely a comfortable place to sit down there in the middle of the woods. Now we're going to look at something called the Lily Pond Stone, which is right behind Skytop in a smiley tower, called Lily Pond appropriately, and lots of lilies there. And somebody sent me this picture of the stone, and it reminded me of some other big boulders that I saw in the Shawangunk Mountains. And when I was up there on the summer solstice, there was a light phenomenon. So this is the back of the stone, and you can see a shaft of light is protruding or penetrating down at the bottom there. And on the solstice, when that light penetrates at sunset, you get this light projection below the base of the stone, this tannet or triangle symbol. So I thought that was quite interesting, and somebody looked at it and called it a glow hole below the dolmen. Very equilateral, and some people suggest it could be a symbol of fertility or goddess worship. And it's showing at 3:03, which is what you would expect for the solstice sunset in the summer. And if you think about who the very first people who came into our region might have been, and when that might have been, 10,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago, it keeps getting pushed back. But they came with a belief system, and they were probably a maritime culture that came from the coast and started working their way inland at the end of the last ice age. And they would have been sun worshipers, and they would have been goddess worshipers, and they would have brought that belief system with them. And they also would have been master survivalists. And they would have potentially set up monuments to express those spiritual beliefs. Here's another interesting stone on the summit of Bonteque Crag, a little, just a few, maybe a mile and a half north of Lily Pond in Skytop. And as you get up onto the summit, you find this unusual stone. And my friend Ian there is standing on the summit stone. That's the very highest point of Bonteque Crag. Everything drops away from that point. And he was sitting, now I'm standing on that stone and I'm watching him eat lunch. And I noticed that the stone he's leaning on looks like it had been shifting in its position in the bedrock. And sure enough, you can tell that it was shifted. You can tell that at one point, that curve lined up with that curve. And this whole thing has been shifted probably about 8 or 9 inches from its original position where it lined up in the bedrock. Now, you know, bedrock does move, and glaciers do move pieces of bedrock, and this was glaciated at some point. So maybe when the glaciers receded, they shifted this. But if they did a really good job of orienting it, because it is very triangular. If you're up there on the summer solstice at sunrise, you see that where that stone is now oriented to, about 57 degrees, is exactly where the sun comes over the horizon on the longest day of the year. So somebody at some point, in my opinion, shifted this stone to make it align with where the sun would come over the horizon on the solstice. And you know, who and when, that's an open question. And again, here's the tool that helps you determine the azimuth. It's a little more than 60 because it's not right on the horizon, it's a little above the horizon. Now, just about a mile north of that stone, you come across this large boulder, which is very similar to that Lily Pond stone. This one's got a north point. This is also what I would call a compass stone, but also a calendar stone because it aligns with another large boulder for a solstice, sunset, sunrise alignment. To me, this looks very intentional. You've got shim stones. You've got, you know, a south point, a north point. It's a north point again, a west face. And it's also at an unusual angle. You know, if it melted out of the glacier, it just doesn't seem like it would settle in that position with the base stones propping it up at that unusual angle. And here on the winter solstice, you can see the sun sets and illuminates that stone. And I was up there with my bike, so you can see me wearing a helmet there. And this is a diagram of that stone showing its axis and its orientation to the cardinal directions. And if you're looking towards the northwest where that stone is oriented, you can see that North Shawangunk Dolmen in the southeast, and you can see Picamous Perched Rock, which is known as Reconnoiter Rock on the DEC maps there in the northwest. If you hike up there onto Table Mountain towards the summit of Picamous, you come on this interesting stone, again on the maps known as Reconnoiter Rock. To me, it has a very avian profile, looks very bird-like from that aspect. Also has a north point, a west nose, and a east nose. And it's got a very convenient sun shade line there that allows us to show exactly where the north orientation is. So those two stones line up on an azimuth of 122 degrees southeast and 303 northwest, or 318 magnetic. And if you do a profile, you see that there is line of sight from those two locations. So you could actually, if you were in one location pre-dawn or after sunset and lit a signal fire, potentially you could see that from each location. And where that stone aligns, there's actually a second alignment with that Bonteque Crag summit stone with some petroglyphs in Frost Valley, also on that parallel azimuth. All right, so we're now going to go up to Woodstock and look at this site in Overlook Mountain, Lewis Hollow. Very interesting site. This site also has what I call a serial use. People have been using it for many years for many different purposes, going back to prehistory. And you can see Native Americans were documented there, 4,000 years ago. A lot of bluestone quarrying there. This is in the winter. This is just a chronology of the different uses of that land, going back to Native American up through resource exploration and exploitation by Europeans, land subdivision for the Hardenberg patent and Livingston purchases. Of course, lumbering and bluestone quarrying and tourist industry all existed on Overlook Mountain and throughout the Catskills. So we did a GIS survey of this site. And these are some of the locations that were plotted. We've got large cairns, 6 of them. We've got 2 serpent effigy walls up at the 1,500-foot mark or just below that, and dozens of smaller cairns and a few springs. And this survey was actually done by the New York State Museum GIS specialist, Susan Winchell Sweeney. And she sent this to me, and I didn't really notice anything that jumped out at me at first, but then somebody suggested maybe just map the large constructions. Everything that's basically that you see there in blue or red are between 50 and 100 feet in length, very large constructions. And again, a friend suggested maybe it was a constellation. And I was skeptical about that, but I did trace it out, just those 8 locations, and connected them in the only logical way possible. And then what I did was I compared that. Here it is laid out on the topographic map. And these are some of the features in the different locations on the ground. And you can see the serpent wall. There's actually 2 of them. You can see some of these great cairns, which are up to 100 feet in length and 60 feet high. This cairn was actually dated to 1390 AD, give or take 60 years, using OSL or optical stimulated luminescence dating. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. And most of these have a downslope retaining wall, which prevents gravity from pulling these constructions down the mountain. So they were also built to stand the test of time. Now, when I started speculating about whether this could be a constellation, the other constellation sites that are represented on the ground throughout the world are actually mirrored images of what you see in the sky, as above, so below, as they say. So when I compared the construction on Overlook Mountain to the constellations in the Northern Hemisphere, the only one that came close was Draco, the snake or the serpent constellation. And if you compare the 2 side by side, they're actually quite similar. And I was struck by this. I mean, I kind of dumbfounded and scratched my head for a long time that it was such a close match between what was on the mountain and what was in the sky. And using any kind of astronomy software program like Stellarium, and if you were to put in the coordinates of the site on the ground, you would see Draco is in the sky above that Lewis Hollow site and Overlook Mountain always, spinning around celestial north. So celestial north, as you probably all know, is where the Earth's axis points to in the sky. It's marked by the closest star to that location, which is Polaris now. But if you go back in time, it's actually Thuban, the 3rd star in the tail of Draco. And as that position of celestial north in the sky moves due to precession of the equinox, it describes a slow 26,000-year cycle that many ancient cultures recognized in their mythology. Another gentleman named Herman Bender out in Wisconsin documented Scorpius and what he called the stick man, other constellations that appear to have been constructed on the ground that represent both Scorpio and Libra. This gentleman named Lee Pendleton down in Fort Mountain, Georgia, also believes he has a representation in a stone wall of what he says is the Big and Little Dipper, as well as Draco. And the Serpent Mound in Ohio also is configured partially to the configuration of Draco in the night sky. Researcher David Johnson found in Bear Brook up in New Hampshire what he called the Big Dipper constellation, or Ursa Major, in large great cairns built on the ground. And as I mentioned, this is a representation of where the serpent effigy is on Overlook Mountain in Lewis Hollow, and the stellarium program showing that Draco does appear in the sky above Overlook. So in a sense, it's marking Overlook Mountain as a beacon for the celestial north. Any ancient people who lived in the view shed of Overlook Mountain that wanted to orient themselves to where celestial north was simply had to look towards Overlook, and they would have that beacon. So viewed as a geoglyph from above, this component petroform mirrors Draco. And as I mentioned, the site coordinates shown that in Starry Night Pro show that Draco does appear above that site location. Researcher named Mark Colato, who's a mathematician and statistician, looked to correlate how closely the petroform on Overlook matched the constellation in the sky, and he found about an 80 or 81% match between what was built on the ground and what's actually in the sky, which is pretty darn good if you weren't, just using primitive methods to construct something basically by sight. Getting it that close is pretty good. As I mentioned, Draco is an important constellation in many different cultures, from the ancient Chinese to the Greeks, both who referred to precession as the Great Year, to the Persians, to the Celts, to the Norse. In Scandinavia, they all recognized Draco as a serpent or snake constellation, and they really believe that its movements and its relationship to celestial north would portend good or bad things depending on what kind of events were in the cards. Not always good things. And this is just showing the transit of Draco and Thuban and how it becomes the pole star after several thousand years, and then after 12,000 years becomes the pole star again, which is now occupied by Polaris. And of course, all of this type of mythology is pre-Christian and goes back thousands of years before the Christian era. And I can't help wonder if perhaps the axis of the earth might have been seen as the tree of life, with the serpent Draco always circumpolar, always coiled around that staff. It's interesting to contemplate. Now, as I mentioned, the site was dated by Professor James Feathers from the University of Washington. He was there with some Stony Brook University scientists, and they took samples from beneath one of the, actually from beneath two of them, two of the features in Lewis Hollow, and dated them. And this is just showing some of the methodology for how these samples were gathered, because using what's called optical stimulated luminescence, you have to gather samples in complete darkness because they're sent to a laboratory. And basically what you're looking to determine is when sunlight last shone on the minerals within those samples. The quartz and the feldspar minerals react differently once they're buried than they do when they're exposed to sunlight. So these samples were taken non-invasive. We didn't have to destroy any of these piles. We did this with permission from Native American tribes who used this site still for ceremony. And you can see one of the collection cocoons. And with OSL, which is only about 20 years old, it's not really generally accepted quite as much as, say, radiocarbon dating or carbon-14, but it's getting there. And the more sites that they can corroborate with carbon-14 that are done with optical luminescence helps validate that type of methodology. But you can see where they've dug and took their samples from is quite a distance or quite a length below the surface. You have to peel back the forest floor to where you get to the lowest courses, and then you leave a little dosimeter there with bromide in it that gets buried and then retrieved a year later. And that allows the scientists in the lab to calibrate the dating based on the leaching of the bromide. Once it's in that little container and reburied, it starts reacting differently because no more sunlight is shining on it. And the samples are packaged opaquely and they have to be shipped ground, because if you ship them by the air, cosmic rays will actually contaminate the particles within the bromide. So they have to be packaged and sent very carefully. And this is one of the collection cocoons for the sediments below. So I believe is a video. I don't know if it's going to play. Oh, look at that, it is. Just showing how many tarps we had to put on to block out all the light. And there are two researchers who have been in there, Dr. Feathers and one of the research assistants, for about an hour. with headlamps. And this is just basically showing when they've signaled that they're all done, you take the tarps off, and I think there's 5 of them all together before you get to the actual tent. And when they're in there, they're telling you to put the tarps on until they tell you they see absolutely no light. It's perfectly black, nothing penetrating. And then you can just see as they're emerging from the collection cocoon. So these are the dates that were retrieved from 2 different features that were there. I misspoke earlier when I said 1390, actually 1510. 1390 was the date without the dosimeter correction. So once they corrected using the dosimeter, the date was brought up to 1510. And Dr. Feather's report was peer reviewed and published in this journal in 2022. So it helps validate it. As I mentioned, the site is also oriented to the winter solstice sunrise, and the Lenape turtle clan of the Munsee Ramapo come up there and have used the site for ceremony. Here we are on the winter solstice at 10 degrees, and we're starting a fire in a traditional method. This is the altar where they set up their ceremonial accoutrements or items for ceremony. And we asked them about why they chose this location. And they mentioned that it was a portal from the underworld. And when you see 2 stones like that, a bedrock with rubble in between, they explain that that's a way of basically regulating the energy that comes out of that portal, blocking the portal in a way that would allow the shaman or the ceremony leader to, again, communicate on his terms and not necessarily the terms of the underworld. In the top right there is Chief Vincent Mann of the Ramapo Lenape Munsee Turtle Clan. This is some of the accoutrements that they used during that ceremony in the direction of the rising sun on the shortest day of the year. And it's multi-generational ceremony. And of course, the purpose of welcoming the sun back on the winter solstice is the increasing daylight leading towards the harvest or the agricultural planting season in the spring. Okay, just a couple more sites here and we'll be wrapping up. This is a site up in Plattekill, actually south of here, just about 8 miles on Marlborough Mountain. And this is a beautiful turtle effigy. You can see it's quite large. You can see the head of the turtle, the mouth of the turtle. Very puzzling whether this is set up by humans or whether this is natural. But again, as I mentioned earlier, if Native Americans or ancient indigenous people came across this, this would have a lot of meaning to them. And there's a lot going on this site. I already mentioned about the turtles. There are petroglyphs there, and there are also light phenomenon. On the equinox, as the sun is setting to the west, it puts a light ball right there behind the head of the turtle in a little gathering space, a little grotto there. So this is on the equinox at sunset. You also have a shadow effect where on the solstice at noon time, you get this orthogonal shadow, perfectly 90 degrees, that moves up into position, pointing where that ball of light is caught on the sunset on the equinox. So very much a calendar site. There's some inscriptions here that people have interpreted as a meteor or asteroids falling from the sky. You can see 2 circular carvings there. So if you look at those up here with tails leading away, what do you see below it? People interpret those, and those are pigments. Those are plant pigments. And people see a human with their arms raised above their head, and also an animal on the right with its legs, so in profile. It's hard to say if that's exactly what this is or not, but people have interpreted this as potentially a memorializing of the Younger Dryas impact event, where things were falling from the sky at the end of the last ice age. This could have been a recording of that by the humans who were around that may have witnessed or experienced that event. So we know it happened. We know people were here. Would there be recordings of it on the landscape? That's something that we may never know. It's also this interesting crosshatch. It's also associated with calendar or calendar. keeping track of time. And a sun glyph is nearby as well. You can see with the circular center and the rays leading away from it. There are also some very interesting portals up there. These are not man-made, although that may have been carved out and chipped away to create that portal. It is oriented to the winter solstice sunrise. And it's hard to see from this summit, but you're actually looking down at the Hudson River, and you can see it from this location a few miles away. This is another portal near that site, also has an orientation similar to the other one, aligned not so much in this case with the winter solstice sunrise, excuse me, but the summer solstice sunset. This is Michelina Picaro, who's Chief Man's wife, sitting in that portal. As I mentioned below, some of those portal alignments are recognized in this chart that references Native American alignments. There's another turtle marker up there, another potential turtle stone here. That one rocks. If you get on it, you can get it to rock a little. Now, the last site we're going to look at, and I don't know how we're doing for time, but I think we're okay still. The Turtle Rock site that I just showed you in Marlborough is the X on the left. And what you have on the right there is Dan's Camera Point, known as the Devil's Dance Chamber, and the mouth of the Wappingers Creek. And when I looked at the relationship between Dan's Camera Point and the mouth of the creek, Dan's Camera Point was named Dan's Camera Point when Henry Hudson sailed up in 1609. His crew witnessed about a day's sail north of Manhattan, just north of Newburgh, in the evening, a ceremony taking place on a point of land where natives were, their bodies painted, were dancing around rings of fire. And to the good Dutch, Puritan Calvinists, they saw this immediately as devil worship, and they called it the Devil's Dance Chamber. And to this day, it's called Dan's Camera Point. And unfortunately, there's a power plant that was built there. But when I looked at that relationship in Curtis Hoffman's chart, I realized that the point of land is oriented perfectly with the mouth of the Wappingers Creek to the north and east. And you can see that the azimuth is 57 degrees, which is exactly what is on his chart. And using Google Earth from the point of land, you can actually simulate the sun rising on the longest day of the year. So you can see up in the upper left, it's the summer solstice, 21st of June. It's sunrise at 5:30 in the morning, and you can see the sun coming up over the horizon, precisely aligned with the mouth of the creek from the point of land. What's interesting, and you may know this as astronomers, is in the evening of the summer solstice sunrise, in that same location, you have the rise of Pleiades. And Pleiades was an important constellation for Native Americans, again, for understanding when to plant in the springtime. It was very much a constellation that was associated with agricultural activity. So a professor from Harvard University named Gary Urton looked at some of this research, and he basically said, well, you got to look at the reciprocal from the mouth of the creek over the point of land, because you're going to have something from there as well. So this is the mouth of the creek over the point of the land, and what you have is a winter solstice sunset. And in that same location, after the sun sets, later in the evening, what you have is actually a galactic alignment where the Milky Way sets vertically to that point where the sun set on the solstice. So to me, this is very confirming. And Urton, who was actually the chair of anthropology for quite a while before he got in trouble and is no longer in that position. But Urton was known for interpreting the Incan knots in tapestries as a language and as a alphabet. And his graduate students for the last 20 years have been following up on that research on the Incan knots. But he's also known for many books on Incan astronomy. And he clued me in that there could be a reciprocal to the summer solstice sunrise, which is the winter solstice sunset. So to me, all this is very self-evident and speaks for itself, and is probably why that point of land on the Hudson River was so important to the Native Americans. And it was most likely the green corn ceremony that was taking place when Hudson sailed by with his crew, and they actually marked it in the crew's log that ceremony was taking place, and that name, Devil's Dance Chamber, came and stuck. So also who looked at a lot of this research was Dr. Romaine from Ohio State. And he made a statement which I think sums things up nicely, which is that it's clear to me that the Northeast has been totally and inappropriately marginalized by the mainstream. The Northeast US is right up there with the Southwest, Midwest, effigy mounds, lower Mississippi Valley, and other traditions in terms of archaeoastronomical alignments, sensitivity to landscape features, and cosmological understandings. So I'm going to end with a couple of shout outs here. These folks, known as the Triad of Digital Technologies, employ both, or I should say, 3 different elements, which is LiDAR, handheld LiDAR scanning, which is what Tom Elmore is doing there. Eva Giebich is a mapper, a GIS expert. So she takes the LiDAR scan, the detailed survey of LiDAR, and she geolocates it accurately into mapping software. And then Dave Gutowski up there on the top, he imports that file into a program like Stellarium so that you can analyze these sites in a way that they'd never really been analyzed before, kind of a holistic method that allows you to see them from all angles, all times of year, relate them to the sky, past, present, and future. So this is really the future of this kind of research. Also want to mention Overlook Mountain Center up in Woodstock, a nonprofit which I've chaired for the past 12 years. And we do this type of research, and we take hikes to these sites for folks, and you can find out more about that on our website. And lastly, I will mention NERA, the New England Antiquities Research Association, which I was proud to have served 2 terms as vice president. And they have wonderful conferences. They just had one in Fishkill, May 3rd, 4th, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, they're a group that you can look at and find out more information. Lastly, my publisher would be upset if I didn't mention my books. So Spirits in Stone documents quite a bit of the research that's in this presentation. I have 2 previous books out. These are basically essays that research the evolution of human consciousness, civilization, and technology by researchers from around the world. And with that, I say, Danke. Thank you. If you want to entertain a few questions, I did an hour and 15 minutes. So.
Nice. Any questions in the room?
All right.
It's a lot of
Very good.
material.
Oh,
Eric.
yes, sir.
Hold it.
Oh, yes.
So you pointed out the difference between magnetic bearings and true north bearings.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if before Europeans arrived, were magnetic compasses in use, or is that a?
No, all
No.
of this would have been line of sight and type of surveying where there would not have been any type of compass.
Without any compass?
Yep. What's that? The magnetic compass?
Discovered magnetics.
Oh, I think
No,
it
no,
goes back
before that.
much earlier than that.
Much
yeah.
earlier. That's, yeah.
I couldn't say precisely, but
I've
yeah.
come across that recently.
And it's interesting that you bring that up because there are places where you do not need. Right now, I think it's about Western Alabama or Eastern Louisiana. There's a place where the math is easy, 0 or 0.
I used to fly out of Louisville, Kentucky, and it's called the agonic line.
Right. Goes.
And the agonic line is the point where your magnetic and your pole, your physical pole, line up. It's not there anymore.
You hear a lot of speculation these days about
Quickly,
the potential of magnetic pole reversal because our magnetic field is weakening so much, and these locations of north and south magnetic pole, they're on excursions, kind of drifting around. But if you research that, actually, magnetic North Pole right now is closer to geographic North Pole than it's been in many centuries. So I don't think there's a big risk that we're going to have any kind of catastrophic reversal, although the weakening of the Earth's electromagnetic field is a legitimate concern. So with that, if there are no other questions, again, I thank everyone for coming out.
Were there any questions on online?
There was a chat.
Excellent.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for a good presentation indeed. All right. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Let me make sure this one is muted before I talk in stereo. For those who are joining us for the first time tonight, a lot of us go up to Pasquale's Pizza up the road. If you'd like to join us and have a little bit of chat, feel free. And with that, I'll close the session. We'll see everyone next month. Thank you.